평일 낮에 진행하는데 많이들 와주셔서 너무 감사드리고요. 저희 오늘 오신 해이든이라고 하시는 분은 네, 저희 굉장히 뉴욕도 그렇고 샌프란시스코부터 해서 미국에서 굉장히 많은 활동을 해주시는 분입니다. 그래서 보전 관리자로서 활동이 굉장히 활동하시고요. 그리고 이제 액티비스트로서 비디오 보존부터 이제 뭐 필름 보존도 그 디지털 보존까지 많은 분야를 다루고 계신 분이신데요. 그 중에서도 오늘은 저희가 조금 비디오 보존에 약간 초점을 맞춰서 진행을 하려고 합니다. 저희가 필름 같은 경우에 저희 한국에서 현상소가 다 자료원 제외하고는 다 사라진 것도 있었고 이후로 이게 테이프 플레이어라든지 테이프 자체의 성질 때문에 계속 이제 영화를 저희가 뭐 결혼식이라든지 아니면 가족 기록물 같은 것들 아니면 영화를 그때 6mm로 많이 찍었으니까요. 많이 가지고 계실 텐데 그 영상들을 어떻게 지킬 수 있는지 오늘 얘기를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 준비되셨나요?
Yeah, let's do it.
네, 그럼 좀 재미있게 좀 들어주시고요. 저희 끝나고 나서 이제 몇 가지 질문 받을 수 있는 타임 가지도록 할 테니까요. 들으시는 동안 질문사항 있으시면 기억해 두셨다가 나중에 질문해 주시면 되겠습니다. 그럼 시작하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm really humbled and grateful to be here. The Korean Film Archive has an amazing reputation in the States, so this is very exciting for me. So thank you all for being here. I think one of the reasons why I was asked to speak today was in large part because Korea has such an amazing output of material, and it's just not possible for the Korean Film Archive to save all of it. So I was asked to speak a little bit about the collective that I'm working with, and where we attempt to use our resources together as a collective to help preserve our films. So the act of preservation is, in my mind, a generous act. Most of us who are in my field are in it because we feel intensely the value of sharing knowledge and making that knowledge discoverable for future generations. As an archivist and also as a community activist working with the old volunteer group Transfer Collective, I've seen entire communities come together in support of preserving audiovisual material. So Transfer Collective, which is pronounced Transfer, is an organization I work with outside of my work at New York University. It is a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that seeks to lower the barriers of media preservation for individual small arts organizations and independent media makers such as many of you who are here today. The Transfer is inspired in part by video collectives in the United States that thrived up until the 1990s. They were comprised of activists and artists who felt the mainstream media was not telling the full story about what was going on in the world. And by sharing equipment, knowledge, and resources, video collectives sought to create an alternative space for disseminating information that was free from corporate interests. In the same spirit, Transfer Collective seeks to share knowledge and resources about media archiving in order to balance the historic record with a diversity of voices. The institutions like New York University, where I work, like the Korean Film Archive, simply cannot preserve everything. So the ethos of Transfer Collective, and one that I will try to impart to you today, is that the only way we can preserve everything is by engaging everyone. And some of the ways we do that is through workshops and pop-up digitization events and screenings, such as this recent event held by XFR Collective at the Leslie Loman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York City. For that event, we asked neighbors and supporters of the museum to stop by and have some of their tapes digitized as part of a larger effort to preserve the memory of gay and lesbian communities that thrived in New York during the AIDS crisis. So digitization events are not all that we do. We also partner with small organizations on digitizing tapes and training teams on how to preserve AV material. So this presentation is a shortened version of a XFR Collective workshop. It is focused on audiovisual preservation activities that are attainable for individuals and small organizations, and above all, performed with a generous spirit that binds your work to the people around you, people who can help you. So while the information here will be brief, I hope that it kickstarts some activities and provides you with resources that you can continue with your own preservation project. So for the rest of the hour, I'll be informing you of some of the preservation risk of analog and digital media materials, providing you with guidance on how to take the next step with a preservation plan. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some ideas about how to think of preservation as part of a life cycle of a creative work. So physical media objects, including hard drives that store digital files, have a shelf life. Unlike paper materials, that shelf life is not centuries, but decades. In the case of tape and digital objects, the shelf life is intertwined with the availability of properly functioning equipment. So that's because electronic media, unlike film, is machine readable. So this is the main difference between film, tape, and digital. The film is a photochemical process. All you need is a light source to see what is recorded onto the film. But with magnetic tape and digital, you need a machine to interpret that for you. So you might want to get your notebooks out, because I'm going to now share some tips on how to stabilize your film, tape, and digital materials in order to lengthen their shelf life while you plan for a preservation project. Okay, so please note that this presentation is by no means exhaustive. We don't have a lot of time. But there are a number of resources, and most of them are in English, unfortunately. But they can help you identify the formats in your collection and give you tips on how to preserve them. So I highly recommend the Preservation Self-Assessment Program, or PSAP. It's a project from the University of Illinois. It is a free online tool that helps collection managers, that would be you, prioritize efforts to improve conditions of the collection. Okay, so first we're going to start with film, and then we're going to go to magnetic media, which is video and audio, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about digital. Okay, so the preservation tip number one, and this goes for all types of media, is you want to know your format. The three main film types are 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, and Super 8 millimeter. If you have film among your individual collections, then you very likely already know the difference in size, which relates to how large they project on the screen. But if you aren't familiar with these formats and you have some in your care, be aware that they require specific sizes of containers and reels in order to be stored properly. Speaking of storage, preservation tip number two is store films in a cool, dry environment. In the moving image archiving field, film is considered the most stable of all analog formats. When properly stored in cool and dry climates, we believe content can be accessible for as long as paper materials, as evidenced by the durability of films that have survived since the birth of film in the 1890s. So when film goes bad, it is usually because it is not stored properly. Film does not respond well to humidity, high temperatures, it warps, it rusts, it grows mold, and it starts to shrink, and it becomes more and more difficult to put into a projector or a film scanner. The recommended temperatures are ideally less than 0 degrees Celsius, but not more than 12 degrees, with a relative humidity of 30 to 50%. Humidity is easily measurable using a low-cost humidity gauge called hygrometer. Number three is store films flat. This is only true for film. All other media formats are stored upright. So film should be stored stacked horizontally or flat like a pancake. From the PSAP guide that I just introduced, it says it's best to store film flat on an inert plastic core because of its considerable weight and the way that it is wound. Doing so will allow the film to maintain a round, even shape. The preservation tip number 4 is replace poor housing. So while films wait for digitization, and they can wait a long time, they should be stored on cords in ventilated polypropylene or polyethylene plastic containers. So these containers are referred to as inert, as they do not contain acidic components that degrade film. If your film is rusted, it is likely lost, so you want to get it out of metal cans and off of metal reels as quickly as possible and put them on plastic cords and plastic cans. So number 5, you want to store with acid-free materials. So in general, keep all archival material in boxes on shelves that are not treated with acidic materials. Acid-free boxes are very common and they can be easily purchased. Avoid using any kind of non-inert packing materials such as packing peanuts, styrofoam, that kind of thing. And number 6, you want to remove degraded and deteriorated materials. Films that smell like vinegar is an indicator that the film is shrinking and should be digitized as soon as possible. So as I said, when films shrink, it's often due to heat or humidity, and it becomes harder to scan them. Smelly films should also be separated from the other films, as there is evidence that vinegar syndrome is contagious. Likewise, if you suspect a film contains mold, please remove it from the collection. Isolate moldy films and other materials in a sealed plastic bag until you can get them mold treated, if you can get them mold treated. Okay, so now we're at magnetic media, which is my favorite. Many of the preservation tips that we have for magnetic media are the same that we have for film. So remember, magnetic media includes both audio tape and videotape formats. Magnetic media refers to upward 100 different formats, both audio and video. Each format has its own unique needs, but the PSAP guide can help. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about every format now. Again, store in a cool, dry place is very important. The ideal temperature is a little higher than film, but it's a little less than 12 degrees Celsius, but not more than 15. The relative humidity is the same. Okay, so store vertically, never flat if you can help it. Vertical storage minimizes damage to the edges of tapes, which can slip over time. Remove items that contain mold. Again, mold is extremely common for video, and it can only be treated by a trained professional, which is nearly impossible to come by. Now, my personal feeling is that unless you are willing to put a lot of time and money into rescuing highly valuable content from a videotape, it's that I think that you should just get rid of it. Just get it out of there. You don't want it to infect the other tapes, and you don't want it to affect your health. Acid-free, and no styrofoam. So again, it's all about any of these kinds of materials can affect our ability to digitize the tape. So keep away from equipment that contains magnets or emits magnetism. So magnetism can erase the content of the tape. So these speakers over there, these old speakers, have really big magnets in them. Now, I am personally aware of at least one incident where an entire day's film set recording was lost when an intern put a stack of audio reels on top of a speaker. So definitely want to keep magnetic tape from anything that's causing magnetism. So I'm gonna give a little speech. I think it's important for everyone to hear. Is that recordings that were made to tape are the most at risk of all media formats, and there is little we can do to improve the shelf life. We call it the magnetic media crisis. And video and audio archivists like myself have given ourselves a deadline of 2025, that's just 5 years from now, to digitize, stabilize, and preserve as many of these recordings as possible, or risk the content being lost forever. So it sounds dramatic, and it is, but it's for a good reason. The magnetic media is not only degrading rapidly due to the mortal technical components of the tape, but because an industry that manufactured and repaired the playback equipment is gone. So I'm very worried about magnetic media. Nearly every major event of the last 20th century is recorded on either videotape or audio tape, from bombs to birthday parties, and 1 million hours of stories from oral histories to interviews to the Nagra tape that we used to use, film productions are all locked away on tape. So digitizing videotape and audio tape is increasingly expensive, but unlike film, we don't have the luxury of letting it sit on a shelf while we wait for resources to become available. The truth of the matter is, if we don't digitize in the next half century, but very likely what we don't digitize will be lost. So why is this happening? At the top is the cross-section of a single layer of videotape. The magnetic layer, the top layer, is the part that holds the audiovisual information contained on the tape. So the binder is the lubricant that stores the magnetic particles and helps the tape glide through the machine. It is made of complex molecules called polymers. Polymers are very strong, but they can be compromised by the appearance of water molecules in the air. So this is called hydrolysis, and it is the process that causes soft binder syndrome, which causes the tape to break down and eventually shed. And as you can see here, the shedding gets in the equipment and damages the equipment. So there's only one known remedy for the effects of hydrolysis, and that is a process that we call baking. It's also referred to as incubation. And when we bake a tape in a low temperature oven for a long period of time, and at one place we used a booth dehydrator, we can temporarily remove the moisture from the tape long enough to digitize the content. But fear not. The good news about magnetic media is that it is much easier and cheaper to digitize, as my friend Brendan is showing you right now. You may even be able to do it at home if you have the right equipment, but generally you just need an analog to digital converter and the right adapters and software for installing into your computer. So now it's probably going to be a good time to talk about digitization and the preservation of a digital file. So what is the best file format for analog to digital preservation depends on how much money you are willing to pay for storage in exchange for quality, which, let's face it, is subjective. Now, we're going to come back to these two images a little later, but you can see that there is almost no discernible difference between them, though one is more compressed than the other, but you can't tell. Now, as filmmakers, if you are a filmmaker, you probably want to know what is the best digital format that will not only give you the highest picture quality results for sound and image, but also retain all of the information needed to perform color correction. For video, the format is uncompressed, V210 wrapped in QuickTime. For film, it's DPX, JPEG 2000. For audio, it is broadcast wave. And for born digital works, it is recommended that you preserve in the original format without alterations. But these formats yield enormous files that are becoming more and more difficult to manage in the aggregate, especially for individuals and small organizations. This chart, which is in the pamphlet that some of you have today, gives estimates of each file type per hour of content. And you can see uncompressed is about 100 gigabytes per hour. So attitudes towards master file formats have been changing, especially as we learn about the effects that massive server and technological waste have on the environment. At the end of the day, the answer to the question, what is the best file format, is it depends. So you should do your own research into the best preservation file format that works for your needs and budget. We also, again, there's some tips and tricks in here. But for an even deeper dive, you can check out the many amazing papers that put out by the Federal Agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative, including this chart which maps out the different formats and their characteristics. What I do think is worthwhile is mentioning in the short time that we have is that digital file formats can be characterized in the following way: uncompressed, lossy, and lossless. Uncompressed means that there is no compression occurring at the point of digitization on the visual or oral components of the video. The lossless means that while there is some compression, it is generally not perceivable by the human eye. I personally recommend lossless formats such as FFV1, which is a controversial stance for me to take as an archivist, but for individuals and small organizations, it's just the more sustainable option. So speaking of digital, let's talk about long-term digital storage. To be honest, archivists are still trying to figure out the whole born digital preservation thing. Born digital can be a digital file, but it can also be a DVD, a CD, or even a mini DV tape, which is technically a digital format. But there are some basic tenets of digital video preservation, and they're all rooted in the concept of LACS in English, which stands for lots of copies keep stuff safe. So the beautiful thing about digital files is that they can be copied endlessly and losslessly. Take advantage of that. Put multiple copies in multiple places. Invest in a RAID, which is an array of hard drives, where if one fails, you still have another. Another tenet is what we call geographical dispersion. For those digital files that are important to you, you want to have copies in at least 2 different geographical locations. So often people will keep one copy on a cloud service and the other on a hard drive in their home. Sometimes people keep separate drives in a family member's home. Finally, understand that hard drives are, like film, tape, and audio, are physical objects with a limited shelf life. You want to replace hard drives every 3 to 5 years to minimize the risk of a drive failure, but also to ensure that the files can be accessed in the next wave of computers and their Thunderbugs and their USB crazy. Okay, so just like when making a film, the most important stage of preserving audio-visual material is the planning stage, what we'll call pre-production. While some great films have been created without any sort of pre-production or planning, let's admit that rarely happens. What happens more often is that a filmmaker will find themselves in the middle of a chaotic situation on the set, wishing they had spent just a little more time planning. So the preservation pre-production phase can proceed in different ways, but always includes the following tasks: storage and stabilization, inventory and metadata, and a budget and a schedule. So the most immediate step that you can take is how to assess your materials are stored and put them in environments that slow down deterioration. In the first half of this presentation, we talked about the different media formats and how they should be stored to minimize the risk of losing the content. But this is also a good opportunity to think about how you want to organize the materials. So these photos are from a day when an all-volunteer team of graduate students from NYU helped a small underfunded film distribution organization called Third Roll Newsreel to stabilize its film materials held in the storage unit. So we built cheap but sturdy shelves and from 2x4 wood beams. We removed the films from the cardboard boxes, which were not acid-free, and then we stored them flat, affecting a real film archive as much as possible. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the second part, which is inventory and metadata. So let's say you had all the money in the world to digitize your tape. Where would you store the digital files? What would you name them? How would you know what was on them? How could you find the content yourself or make it discoverable by others? So you might not have an answer to the answer to these questions now, but likely you will have them after you create an inventory. An inventory is a simple spreadsheet or database where you list the title, format, and location and unique ID of each item in the collection and any other information pertinent to your project. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. The one thing I want to stress is the value of a unique ID. A unique ID is a number that should be placed on the tape, and it should be the name that's in your file and on your spreadsheet. So the unique ID links all of these things together. And just skipping ahead a little bit more. Here's just a list of some different kinds of information that you might want to have in your metadata sheet. A lot of it's very intuitive. Year, the name of the production, the file name, the location of the item. All of these things are there to help you find it, so you can find it and so other people can find it. So after you've completed an inventory, you can analyze the data and then you can start your budget. There's something to think about when you manage the budgeting phase. What do you need to purchase to make sure all the materials are in acid-free containers? How much is it going to cost to digitize? What kind of equipment you need to digitize? And the digital storage you need to store the digital items into geographically dispersed locations. So for more on this, check out this website. It's the Community Archiving Workshop Training of Trainers Toolkit. So this has everything you need to start your own community archiving workshop, including inventory list template, a film inspection guide, and supply equipment list. So a preservation project is a project. It is work and it is hard work, but it is rewarding work. And I hope I haven't discouraged anyone by some of the realities of media preservation. But if it does seem daunting, we can let the difficulties be a teachable moment for us as filmmakers. I've long advocated for preservation to be a phase in the filmmaking process. Imagine how things imagine how it would be if we considered preservation from the point of pre-production. Would you have labeled things differently? Would you have budgeted differently? Would you have thought about during production what scenes or images or interviews that you ultimately couldn't use now but might use later? The current production workflow is one that begins with an idea, the development phase, and it ends in post-production and distribution. But I kind of like to think if you put preservation in the mix, then you have a more circular process. So all of the B-rolls and outtakes and camera originals are present and available, so new ideas will spark, new research begin, and a new project will unfold. The most at-risk videotape at the moment is what's called half-inch open reel video, which is the very first portable video format. It is the youngest tape is about 40 years old. The only tapes we can digitize now are the ones that have beaten the odds. Mini DV is also a very at-risk format, even though it's newer, because they're very small and the tape is very thin. ME tapes, which stands for metal evaporate, there's ME and MP. MP is metal particle, and ME is metal evaporate. ME tapes, metal evaporate, are the most at-risk tapes as well. They're just the formula, they're higher quality. When they manufactured the tape, it was at a very high quality, but that formula is degrading faster. But the good thing about mini DV tapes is that it's very easy and cheap to digitize, and you can still get the equipment to do it at home on your home computer. So do it soon. It's all about money and time. And there are some institutions that are engaging in mass digitization projects. And these projects are the university will raise, or institution will raise a lot of money to just digitize everything in the collection. And the University of Indiana has started this project to digitize everything in their collection, and it's costing them $20 million. Yeah. It is a crisis, but in a lot of ways, we kind of already passed a certain point because it just costs so much money to digitize a tape, and the training just isn't there. So that's why that organizations like Transfer Collective are popping up to kind of fill that money gap. There are different institutions that have. If you look up the University of Illinois Media Digitization Preservation Initiative, I don't know if I can look it up here, but they have a lot of great resources on how they're doing their mass digitization project. There are resources. If there's one centralized manual, the answer is no. There are lots of resources here on the Transfer Collective's page, mostly in English, but this document is a collective document by a lot of different people that shows you how to build your own digitization station. A lot of what we digitized are video artists from the downtown scene in New York City. The downtown scene was the countercultural movement in New York that happened between 1969 and the 1990s. So we have a lot of artwork that it was a really creative time for New York City. Punk rock, video art, conceptual art. The artist Basquiat came from that movement. A lot of punk rock stars I'm sure you're familiar with came out of that movement. And we've done some, there are some filmmakers from that era that we have digitized their lost videos. So. Well, a major challenge is just maintaining equipment is extremely difficult because so much of the equipment is just old, and the people who fix the equipment and the people who, especially for a video, they're old and they're dead. And so it becomes, whenever our machines break down, we have like pneumatic tapes, VHS decks, mini DV decks, and whenever they break, it's so hard for us to fix it. So I'm not an electrician, but I kind of had to learn how to be one in some ways, and a lot of archivists do have to, we have to be electricians, we have to fix a circuit board, we have to figure out how to find the belts that go around the motors, and all of that is very difficult. That's the biggest part that I'm worried about, is that we're not gonna get the interest from engineers to help us create playback equipment that is functioning for a long time. And that's when we talk about deadline 2020, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about that the equipment, we can't, it's gonna be so hard to find, to purchase, and to get repaired. So that's what I really worry about. Something that I forgot to mention about Transfer Collective is that in exchange for the digitization work that we do, we put the digital materials online. So we have everybody who allows us to digitize their tape, they have to sign an agreement that states that they will let us put it online. Now, if they don't want us to put it online, we won't. But that's generally that's the relationship, is that we're doing this work for you for free. We're lowering that risk, that barrier to access. So in exchange, we want you to put it out there in the world for other people to use. Anyone can download these videos. Not everybody is happy about it, and sometimes we have to have a conversation about how important it is for other people to be able to access this work. And so this is all online on archive.org, and you can just go to Transfer Collective's page and find it, but be careful because there's a lot of pornographic content.
오늘 바로
That's New York.
free porn.
Free porn. So sometimes we will, as with all archives, we will get an archive and not everything in it was created by the person who gave us the material. So we do often, what we do is we err on the side of access. So we will digitize and put it online often, but we have a takedown notice on our website, and if anybody comes across it and wants to take it down, we will take it down. It's a very tricky question whether or not to put something online if we don't have the actual rights to do it. And it's kind of a case-by-case basis. If a lot of times, there's been times when we put something online and the creator hasn't seen it in forever and they come across it and they're happy. And then there are other times when they ask us to take it down. So again, we kind of err on the side of access, but we try to make conscientious decisions about whether or not to do it. We're at the point now where we don't have to seek it out. We're only about 20 people, and the material that comes to us, and we're all volunteer, we all have day jobs, so it's very hard for us to we can't do these big projects quickly. So but people come to us. They know about us by now. The Leslie Lohman Gallery at the museum, they just asked us invited us to be there. So a lot of people just reach out to us via email and just ask us, and then we start the conversation and we start working them. It's a very informal process. It's all about somebody emails us and then the conversation gets started. We could do a whole nother presentation on what you just asked for sure. You know, as an archivist, I think about privacy and people's rights and that relationship to access all the time. And decisions are not made lightly. So with pornographic material is really the only like controversial thing that we've come across so far. We could come across other sensitive materials. With the archive I worked at NYU, just recently someone asked us to remove an oral history from our collection because their opinion at the time, their political opinion, was completely opposite from what it is now. And we had to have a conversation with them because that, you know, what they were at that point in time, they're asking us to remove history from the archive because they changed. And is that ethical or not? It's an interesting question, but yeah, all I can really say is that when it comes to pornographic material, we don't put it online unless we have the creator's permission, but is the creator the person in the film? So we do often go ahead and put it online if we have the creator's permission, but if the actor came out and was like, I don't want that up anymore, we will take it down. It's case by case. There's just no easy answer to it. You just have to be very conscientious and weigh all of your alternatives. I'm sorry I skipped back this part. It's actually an idea that I am working through. It's not really a real thing. However, there are a lot of companies in the U.S. that have an archivist because the company needs to go back and get and retrieve files all the time. Like HBO has an archivist. I don't know if that's actually part of the preservation workflow. I think that after post-production, they just send everything to the archivist, and the archivist deals with it. But I don't personally know a small independent company that's thinking along these lines. So it's kind of like conceptual for me at the moment, but I'm glad that it was very interesting to you, because I would like to talk to more filmmakers and talk to more small production companies and think about how that can happen. And I think it is a matter of money, but I think in the digital age it's a lot easier to think about preservation as part of the process than it was previously. Alright, so a checksum is it's like a digital. I'm sorry, Heather. A checksum is kind of like a digital thumbprint. So when you move a digital file from one hard drive to another, from one place to another, a lot can happen during that time. You can corrupt the file. You can lose the file. You can lose pieces of the file. So what a checksum does is you apply a checksum using a command line tool. I think that, what do you guys use? Do you use Fixity, or you're not using them yet? So there's a tool called Fixity. See if I can find it. But what you can do, if you go to if you just Google Fixity, Fixity, you can find out how to run a command that looks at your digital file and gives you a very long hash, a very long number. and that's your digital signature. So you have that, and then when you move the file, you can validate by file. You run the checksum again after you move the file, and if the hash is the same, then the file is not corrupted. So checksums are a part of a digital asset manager, which is a database that you can run in the background, and it's constantly running checksums to make sure the file is not corrupted. If the checksum is a different number after it's moved, then something happens. So that's kind of what a checksum does, is it just running checksums every time you move a file will let you know if the file has been corrupted at the point of transfer. Sorry, it's a little, I'm floating around a little bit, but definitely Google checksum, for sure.
To translate what you said, 궁글에서 찾아보세요.
So thank you everyone for being here. It's really been great hearing from you and what kinds of things you're interested about AV preservation. I hope that any one of you is inspired to, or maybe you can convince Anjian to start a community archiving workshop here in Korea. But definitely email me or email anyone in Transfer Collective if you're interested in knowing more. It's very hard to navigate this, but yes, thank you.
Is your email address in the pamphlet?
Yes, I know it's that, sorry.
So how do they email you?
Yes, you can definitely email Transfer Collective. If you email the Transfer Collective Gmail, you'll email all of the volunteers, so someone will answer you quickly.
감사합니다.